Imagine owning a gold mine so large it dwarfs almost every other on the planet. Now, imagine being forced to sell every ounce of that gold to a single buyer next door, at whatever price they feel like offering that day. You have no road to any other market, no alternative customer, no leverage whatsoever. You just take the price and say thank you. That is not a hypothetical. That is the story of Canada and its oil for the better part of half a century. A nation sitting on 170 billion barrels of crude, the third largest reserves on Earth, functioning as a discounted fuel supplier to the one country it could never say no to. And for 50 years, every attempt to change that arrangement failed. Pipelines got canceled, courts intervened, politicians argued, billions evaporated until one project refused to die. A pipeline that started as a $5 billion private venture and ended up costing Canadian taxpayers $25 billion before it pumped a single barrel west. Question hanging over Canada right now is brutally simple. Was it worth it, or did the country just place the most expensive bet in its history on an industry the world is trying to walk away from? To grasp what was actually at stake, you need to understand something about Canadian oil that most people outside the energy industry never learn. The crude sitting beneath Alberta is not like the oil you picture gushing from a well in Texas or Saudi Arabia. It is bitumen, a substance so thick and dense at room temperature that it behaves more like cold tar than anything you would recognize as oil. It does not flow. It does not pump. At minus 20 degrees in an Alberta winter, it barely moves at all. Extracting it requires either ripping open the earth with machines the size of apartment buildings in vast open pit mines, or injecting superheated steam deep underground to soften it enough to move. Both methods consume extraordinary amounts of energy just to produce something that still cannot be used directly. Even after extraction, bitumen has to be blended with lighter liquid hydrocarbons before it can travel through a pipeline without simply congealing inside it. That blend is called diluted bitumen, dilbit, and roughly a third of every barrel you ship is the diluent itself rather than the actual crude. You are paying to transport your own packaging, but the real constraint comes at the other end. Processing this heavy sulfur-laden crude requires a specific category of refinery equipped with industrial cokers and hydrocrackers capable of breaking down its unusually heavy molecular chains. Most refineries globally are not configured for it. The ones that were purpose-built to handle crude this heavy were constructed decades ago along the U.S. Gulf Coast in Texas and Louisiana, originally designed to process Venezuelan and Mexican heavy oil. So, when Alberta's oil sands began producing at industrial scale, the destination for almost all of it was geographically predetermined: south, into America, into refineries that had been waiting for exactly this kind of crude. By 2010, that flow had hardened into something that looked less like a trade relationship and more like a structural dependency. 99% of Canadian oil exports moved south through pipelines that were already aging when many of the people building them were still children. Alberta was producing oil at a rate that made it one of the most significant energy jurisdictions on the planet. And all of it, essentially every barrel, had one customer. The moment you have one customer, that customer has you. American refineries on the Gulf Coast understood their position perfectly. They were processing Canadian heavy crude and pocketing margins of $15 to $25 per barrel on the difference between what they paid for it and what they sold the refined products for. That spread existed because Canadian producers had nowhere else to go. The price gap between what Canadian crude fetched and what global benchmark prices were running became known as the Western Canadian Select Differential. At its worst, it hit $30 a barrel. Even at more moderate levels of $10 to $15, it was draining $15 to $20 billion out of the Canadian economy annually. Not as a one-time loss, every single year. Alberta's provincial government did the arithmetic and concluded that every dollar of that discount cost the province $200 million in royalty revenue it never collected. Schools, hospitals, infrastructure, climate investment, all of it was being quietly subsidized by a structural pricing disadvantage that nobody in Washington had any incentive to fix. And Washington actively made things worse. The Keystone XL pipeline, which would have added more capacity south into American refineries, was used as a political prop in Washington for over a decade. Various administrations approved it, canceled it, revived it, and canceled it again, each time sending a clear message to Ottawa that access to American infrastructure was a privilege subject to American political conditions, not a right. Other escape routes were systematically closed off. The Northern Gateway Pipeline, which would have carried Alberta crude west to the British Columbia coast and from there to Asian markets, was cancelled in 2016 following opposition that included well-funded American environmental campaigns. Energy East, which would have brought oil to Atlantic refineries and potentially to export terminals on the East Coast, was abandoned in 2017 after years of regulatory and political obstruction. Every door that might have led somewhere other than America slammed shut. The dependency deepened, the discount persisted, and the billions kept flowing south. But here is what made that pattern so insidious. It wasn't just money leaving Canada, it was leverage. Every canceled pipeline was a negotiating chip Canada would never get to. Play. Every year the dependency continued was another year Washington could make demands knowing Ottawa had no credible alternative to threaten in return. Canada was not just losing revenue, it was losing the ability to say no. And in geopolitics, the ability to say no is everything. The original Trans Mountain Pipeline had been quietly doing its job since 1953. Running just over 1,100 kilometers from Edmonton to a marine terminal at Burnaby on the edge of Vancouver. Its capacity was modest, around 300,000 barrels per day, a fraction of what Alberta was producing, but its direction was everything, west, not south. In 2013, Kinder Morgan, a Houston-based pipeline company, filed plans to expand it. The proposal was to build a second parallel pipeline along nearly the same route, tripling capacity to 890,000 barrels per day. Oil reaching the Burnaby terminal could be loaded onto tankers and shipped directly across the Pacific to refineries in China, Japan, South Korea, and India, 14 to 16 days compared to the 3 to 4 weeks a Gulf Coast shipment would take to reach the same Asian buyers via the Panama Canal. The geographic advantage was real. So was the pricing opportunity. Asian refineries were prepared to pay world prices for a reliable new heavy crude supplier. Access to those buyers would not just reduce the Western Canadian Select discount, it could eliminate it entirely. The economic case was strong enough to be almost impossible to argue against in purely financial terms. The route itself was another matter. Building a pipeline through the Rocky Mountains and down through the Fraser River Valley into one of Canada's most densely populated urban regions is not a straightforward engineering exercise. The expansion required crossing more than 1,400 rivers and streams. It demanded a 2.6-kilometer tunnel bored through solid rock beneath a suburban mountain in Burnaby that took 3 years and exceptional precision to complete without disturbing the neighborhood above it. Avalanche corridors in the mountain sections required construction to pause entirely for extended periods, but none of the physical challenges proved as complicated as the human ones. The pipeline route crossed the traditional territories of 129 Indigenous communities. Under Canadian law, that meant a genuine consultation process, not a notification exercise. Routes were redrawn. Specific sites of cultural significance were avoided, sometimes requiring major engineering redesigns. Some communities reached agreements, others remained opposed. Courts weighed in repeatedly. The project was halted, sent back for additional review, and restarted more than once. Each interruption added months. Each month added carrying costs, inflationary pressure on materials and labor, and fresh political ammunition for opponents on every side of the debate. Now, here is something that rarely gets discussed. The Indigenous consultation process, as painful and expensive, as it made the project, actually forced something important. It forced Canada to confront a question it had been avoiding for generations. Who does the land actually belong to? And who should benefit when resources move across it? Some of the communities along the route eventually negotiated equity stakes in the pipeline itself, meaning they would not just be consulted about its construction, but would share in its revenue for decades to come. That was unprecedented in Canadian pipeline history. It did not silence all opposition, but it introduced a model that fundamentally changed the conversation around resource development in this country. The idea that Indigenous communities could be owners rather than just stakeholders is now part of how Canada thinks about future infrastructure. Trans Mountain did not just move oil, it moved a political idea. By 2018, Kinder Morgan had reached its limit. The regulatory environment was unpredictable, the cost overruns were accelerating, and the company had a fiduciary obligation to shareholders. It could no longer square with the growing uncertainty around the project's completion. They put the expansion up for sale and signaled they were prepared to walk away entirely. The Canadian government faced a decision with no clean options. Let the project die and concede that Canada could not build its way to market access, or step in, buy the whole system, and complete construction with public funds. Justin Trudeau chose the latter. The federal government purchased Trans Mountain, the original pipeline, and the expansion under construction for $4.5 billion. The announcement landed like a grenade. Environmental groups who had voted for Trudeau's party in large numbers felt directly betrayed. Fiscal hawks questioned whether Ottawa had any business running a pipeline company. Indigenous leaders whose communities had not yet reached agreements felt the purchase signaled the government would proceed regardless of their concerns. And the construction still had years left to run. What followed was one of the most operationally complex undertakings in Canadian government history. Ottawa had just bought a pipeline company, not a policy, not a subsidy. An actual operating infrastructure business with employees, contracts, regulators, and construction sites spread across an entire mountain range. The federal government had to learn on the job. Project managers were brought in. Crown corporation structures were established, and the construction ground forward through conditions that would have tested any private operator. Pandemic lockdowns disrupted supply chains and labor availability at precisely the moments when momentum was most needed. Steel prices spiked globally. The cost of skilled welders and heavy equipment operators in remote mountain terrain reached levels that would have seemed implausible when the original budget was drawn up. Every quarter, the numbers grew. Every quarterly update required a new explanation to a parliament increasingly skeptical that the end was anywhere in sight. The final cost reached $25 billion. The original budget had been $5.4 billion. The overrun wasn't the product of corruption or incompetence, though neither would be a complete surprise in a project this size. It came from the compounding weight of regulatory delays, court-ordered reviews, pandemic disruptions, inflation in steel and labor costs, and the sheer complexity of building through terrain, and a regulatory environment that had no equivalent anywhere else in the world. $25 billion, spent by a government that said it also had binding commitments to reduce Canada's carbon emissions. The contradiction was obvious, and the government never fully resolved it. What it argued instead was that Canada would produce this oil regardless, and selling it at world prices was better than selling it at a discount while the energy transition was still underway. And the 1st of May, 2024, the expansion came online. Weeks later, a tanker named the Dubai Angel departed the Westridge Marine Terminal in Burnaby with roughly 550,000 barrels of Alberta crude. It did not turn south toward the Gulf of Mexico. It headed west across the Pacific toward Asia. For anyone who had watched the previous 50 years of Canadian energy policy, the image carried weight that numbers alone cannot fully capture. Canadian crude reaching a non-American buyer on Canadian terms through Canadian infrastructure. The Western Canadian Select Differential began to respond almost immediately, not dramatically, not overnight, but the direction shifted. Asian refineries in China, Japan, South Korea, and India began taking regular cargoes. By 2025, China had become the leading overseas destination for Trans Mountain crude. The share of Canadian oil exports heading somewhere other than the United States remained relatively modest in absolute volume, but the change in pricing dynamics was measurable. When a seller has a credible alternative, the buyer's leverage shrinks. That is not theory, that is what happened. The unresolved questions are real and they are significant. The government still does not have a buyer for the pipeline. Selling a $25 billion asset built to replace a $5 billion one is not straightforward, and the political pressure to transfer ownership to Indigenous communities adds complexity that purely financial logic alone cannot navigate. Meanwhile, the energy transition is not waiting for Canada to sort out its pipeline finances. Global oil demand forecasts are being revised downward with increasing regularity, If demand peaks sooner than the optimists expect and falls faster than the models currently project, the economic rationale for Trans Mountain weakens considerably. A pipeline designed to serve decades of growing Asian demand could find itself carrying declining volumes through infrastructure that costs more than any previous Canadian government had ever spent on a single project. And here is the uncomfortable truth sitting underneath all of that. The country's Trans Mountain was built to serve. China, Japan, South Korea, India are also building out renewable energy capacity at a pace that would have seemed impossible a decade ago. China alone is installing more solar power every year than the rest of the world combined. If Asian oil demand plateaus earlier than expected, Trans Mountain loses its core strategic premise. The escape route leads somewhere that may be shrinking. And yet, the alternative was not neutrality. Doing nothing meant continuing to sell the world's third largest oil reserves at a permanent structural discount to a single buyer who had every incentive to keep that discount in place forever. It meant accepting that Canadian sovereignty over Canadian resources was theoretical in practice, overridden by geography and American market dominance every time it actually mattered. Pierre Trudeau Sr. stood in front of the Canadian Parliament in 1973 and warned that a country which cannot control its own energy cannot truly govern itself. His son spent $25 billion 50 years later trying to prove that warning had finally been heard. Whether the bet pays off or not will become clear over the next decade. What is already clear is that the terms of the relationship have shifted. Canada is no longer a one-customer seller. The Dubai Angel sailing west across the Pacific was not a symbolic gesture. It was a pricing event. It told every American refinery that had grown comfortable buying Canadian crude below world prices that the arrangement they had relied on was no longer guaranteed. Sometimes the most important thing a $25 billion investment buys is not the asset itself. It is the leverage that comes with having built it. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Was this Canada's smartest move in a generation or the last? Great fossil fuel gamble before the world changed the rules? And if you want to keep exploring how geography, power, and money shape the fate of nations, hit subscribe because the next story will change how you see the map.